year's virtual series, Off the Shelf, which is a co-production of the libraries and UNC Press to present new works published by the press that explore racial and social justice in our history and our world. Over the next hour, Shadra Powell will be in conversation with Dr. Brooks about her book. Before we begin, please note that the Q&A box is open for your questions, which we'll have time to moderate towards the end of the hour together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Shadra, our host for this afternoon's conversation. In November 2021, Shadra Powell was appointed as the 10th curator of the Southern Historical Collection, the second woman and the first African-American to hold the role in the collection's 91-year history. Since 2014, she has served as the African-American Collections and Outreach Archivist for the Southern Historical Collection in Wilson Special Collections Library. Please thank you, Shadra, for hosting our off-the-shelf conversation this afternoon.
Hey, thank you, Monica. Thank you for that introduction. And in turn, I will introduce our guest today, Dr. Robin Brooks. I'll read a short bio for her, and then we'll just jump right into the conversation about the book. So Robin Brooks is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research and teaching interests include 20th and 21st century literature, particularly African-American, Caribbean, African, and American multi-ethnic literatures, as well as Black feminist theory, post-colonial studies, digital humanities, higher education management, and education policy. Dr. Brooks is a proud native of Miami, Florida. After receiving the International Baccalaureate Diploma from North Miami Senior High School, she attended Florida State University on a Florida Bright Future Scholarship, where she graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa a year early with a BA in English in 2003. Before joining the University of Pittsburgh, she was a diversity postdoctoral fellow at the University of San Diego and a provost postdoctoral scholar at the University of South Florida. For the 2019-2020 academic year, she was a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow in residence at Emory University. So we are very pleased and proud to welcome Dr. Brooks. Thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Thank you. I am doing very well. I'm excited to be with you all. I'm excited that you all selected my book for this event. So I'm ready to jump right in. Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I thought that before we talked about like the content of the book, we could talk a little bit about the notion of class and the way that this book interrogates class. And I have to say that when I learned that I was going to be talking to you about this book, late last year, and I've been reading it and talking with my friends about it, and the idea of what is class to all of us. In a group of three, there were three different definitions for what defined a person's class. Some of us thought it was about money. Some of us thought it was about jobs, like is a plumber a working class person? And we were like, no, plumbers make a lot of money. And so, it's complex. And so I wonder, how have you defined class for this book? Why write about class?
Right. So a few things. First, I will talk about the friend circle there. Yeah, what you all said is completely normal. Mm-hmm. So for scholars across fields who study class, the big point of agreement is that defining terms like class, working class, middle class is controversial and it's often contested. People do not fit into neat categories. The line between classes is very blurry, right? And so one point of consensus, however, between scholars is that class shifts and that it is shaped by historic events. So think about right now, the pandemic. And people who are standing in bread lines, right? We see this shift in class right before our eyes right now during this global pandemic. And so, I just have a general definition that I use based on scholars from social sciences as well as scholars from the humanities. And I just say that class is a dynamic group of relationships between a group of people with similarities in economic, social, and political standing. And so that particular definition agrees with multiple fields, no matter what field you're a part of. And so, of course, the book is very interdisciplinary because when you're talking about class, right, you have to bring in sociology, you have to bring in economics, you have to bring in anthropology. And so my primary research area is literary studies and Africana studies. So the book is definitely very interdisciplinary, and I had to pull on different fields in order to do a good job with explaining the literature.
Yeah, and so I understand that how that frames your writing, but I wonder kind of personally, like what made you like notice class and figure out that this, like just from your own personal history, what makes the subject so intriguing to you?
Yeah, I must say I was a different type of kid, right? So I have been interested in class since I was a child. So I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. And of course, when people hear of Miami, you know, think about the famous beaches and the celebrities. And there are a lot of millionaires who live in Miami, but there are also a lot of people living in abject poverty in Miami and everybody in between. So this is something that shaped me, being aware of and observing all of these wide differences. And so literally since my days of growing up in Miami, I have always thought about class, no matter what setting I entered into in the future. And then fast forward to the Great Recession, right? And so during the Great Recession, whether it was liberal or conservative news headlines, I would see headlines that say the middle class is suffering, the middle class is suffering. And I will always think to myself, well, if the middle class is suffering, then what is happening to the working class? And if we here in the United States are suffering, what's happening to some people in some other nations? And so I said to myself that this is something that I want to write about officially, finally in the future. And during that time as well, I noticed an increase in scholarship in the social sciences about the changes in people's class. And I wanted to know, well, what are the fields that I'm a part of? What are they saying? So the overarching question for the book became, how does the field of literary studies, particularly African diaspora literary studies, participate in this global discourse on class change? So that's how I ended up coming up with the topic officially. But class is something that I have long been intrigued with since my days of Miami. Yeah, growing up in Miami.
Right. I love that, bringing humanities into the conversation, which is the perfect segue for you to help our audience kind of understand the contours of your book and how it's organized. And I wonder if you could just kind of walk us through how you put it together, or what kind of ideas and concepts you unpack in the book.
So great question, because that's important too. So like I said, you know, Miami is a very diverse place. And so I was influenced by people from all over the world. And so I wanted to make sure I tackled a couple of different areas. So my book is split into two parts. The first part is on African American literature, right? And the second part is on Anglophone or English speaking Caribbean literature. And this is all contemporary literature. And I focus on women writers. And the reason why I do that in the book is because I wanted to know what, if any, interventions were women writers doing concerning what is often called the feminization of poverty. And that simply means that the majority of the people around the world are in poverty are women. And so I wanted to know, well, what are women writers doing or saying about this, if anything? So I wanted to focus on them. And so then each of the chapters are associated with a particular topic that's related to class. So for instance, I have a chapter on housing, and housing and that relationship to class disparities, another chapter on education, a chapter on sexual violence, which some people may see as, you know, a triggering chapter, but believe it or not, class status, it can definitely be related to how sexual violence is perceived. And another chapter that extends these conversations of class injustices into human rights violations. And so these topics for each of the chapters, they didn't just come from my brain, right? I allow the creative writing to lead me. So these were the topics that I saw the literary artists focusing on. So I just decided to draw attention to these particular topics. So that's how the book is arranged. And I, of course, have an intro and an epilogue. And in my epilogue, it's very updated because I even have images from January 6th in the epilogue. And I talk about presidential elections in the United States, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. Coincidentally, they all had elections in the same year during that time. And so I talk about that and the significance of what this overall interdisciplinary literary project is doing and how it intersects with these current issues before us. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the title. So, you know, that sits on top of all of this. What do you mean by class interruptions?
Right. So I really like the title of my book. I think it's so clever, right? And so the title does good work because what it does is it presents a major goal for the book, which is I am interrupting the lack of scholarship on class within these fields I study. And I do want to emphasize the word scholarship here. And because I want to know that what I found in my research is that literary artists have long been discussing class differences and class inequalities. It's just that the scholarship on the literary artists and the work of the literary artists, the scholarship has not kept up. And so that's where my book adds to the conversation. Overall, my book contributes to the overall context of the modern historiography of class. And so also the subtitle is important too, because you have to be really careful when you're naming something. So if it's just class interruptions, you know, a lot of people may automatically assume that the book is about school, right? And about some school kids interrupting the teacher. Right. So hence the subtitle, Inequality and Division. And so I wanted people to know automatically that I'm talking about inequalities here and the sensitive subject of interracial class divisions as well. So yeah, I really like the title. It's catchy. And the image on the cover of the book works well with that title as well.
Right. Yeah. I was just thinking while you were talking about the novels that you highlight in the book, and I wonder for our audience if you could just list the four that are included, the authors and the titles.
Yeah, so I actually cover several books in there. And so I was very generous with the titles of my body chapters where I let you know what novels, the key novels that I'm exploring. So there are multiple novels throughout the book, but I highlight Gloria Naylor, Toni Morrison. Gloria Naylor's Linda Hills in particular is the novel that I highlight. A couple of novels from Toni Morrison, her novel Love, entitled Love, also her earlier novel Tar Baby, and then some Caribbean artists like Olive Senior. Olive Senior is a very well-known Jamaican writer, and she's mostly known for her poetry. But the novel that I examine in my book is her first novel. It was published in the 2010s, and it's called Dancing Lessons. I'm actually teaching it right now in the course that I'm teaching on campus. But also Diana Macaulay. Diana Macaulay is a Jamaican native as well. And I teach her novel, Dog Heart. And she was a longtime journalist in Jamaica. And I also write on, I also write on Onya Kimpadu's Tide Running. And then in the midst of all of those novels, I consistently refer to other novels. So even though I am, putting certain novels at the forefront, you just want people to know that these novels themselves have relationships with other novels. So throughout each of the chapters, I may expand on other narratives as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck. I mean, just as a person who's not an English major or literature, like deep scholar, just, I always assume people just kind of came up with stories like they're fiction. And I don't always know the work that these authors are putting in to unveil real, social issues and challenges. And so I wonder if that had just been a part of your scholarship in undergrad, or like how did those, or even your investigation of the authors themselves, where you could point to what they were doing in the work. Like, how did you arrive?
Right. So a great question there. So keep in mind, I had similar inquiries, right, many years ago when I first got into the field of literary studies as well, because I'm not a creative writer. Yeah. I'm not a creative writer. I don't write novels or poetry or anything like that. I'm a literary analyst and a cultural analyst. So I analyze what these cultural producers produce. Mm-hmm. And so if you listen to any well-known or productive writer, literary artist, creative writer, or cultural producer, you will definitely hear them say that they conduct research. A lot of writers just don't write everything from the top of their head, like it's a figment of their imagination. Mm-hmm. First, they oftentimes conduct research related to something in their particular product that they're ultimately aiming to produce or finalize. And that's very important. Writing and producing is not an easy task, and hence why you hear so many people say, oh, well, it took me 5 years to write this, or it took me multiple years to write X, Y, and Z. Yeah, because they are doing work in the background. Mm-hmm. And what we get the pleasure of seeing is that final product. And one thing I do want to say, though, is that something that I learned very early on, long before I even pursued a bachelor's degree in English, is that, as well as a minor in Africana studies, is that you have to distinguish between the author of a piece and the lives of the characters in that piece that the author has written. So even though, and just like singers, like don't assume that the song that Beyonce is singing is all about her and Jay-Z, right? Mm-hmm. Beyonce may not have even written that song, right? And so that's something to always pay attention to when we're reading their work, that just because they talk about and explore a particular topic in their creative writing doesn't mean that it directly relates to their personal lives. But I really do like that they have such great information. The books that I've chosen to explore, the novels I've chosen to explore for my book, they do lend themselves to social justice, the service of social justice. Mm-hmm. So whether or not that was the original intention, they do, and they work well for that. And I interviewed, I'll say this last point here before I let you ask the last question. But I interviewed some of these authors, and when I interviewed Olive Senior, I directly asked her that question, which is, does your work serve a social or political function? And she said that, she believes that politics is intrinsic to everything that we do. And she feels that her job as a writer is to explore the society and to be subversive. And so she wants to intentionally show people things that they should maybe look at and explore in their societies. And of course, we know Toni Morrison is often quoted for saying she writes for Black people. So, and of course, that doesn't mean that she doesn't want other people to read her book, but I think that's significant that, she was highlighting the point that she wants Black people to be the center of her work. She wants to explore the lives and the living conditions of Black people. And that's very important when you're in a world that often doesn't forefront Black people.
Yeah, I think about libraries so much in terms of, I was thinking about almost like at an eye doctor, it's like, do you see it here? Do you see it there? Do you see it here? Do you see it there? And so the idea of whether it's in the literature, like how's class operating? In the library, how's class operating? Like just giving people these different vantages, and the way that you've been able to do a deep dive into the literature. I mean, it reads like a literary analysis, like you're breaking down, these novels, the narrative structures in novels, and then like taking the macro view of like what this is saying about like real challenges in the world. And so, I was really struck by the chapter on sexual violence, and this idea that Toni Morrison, talks about her novel Love, and this story of is it Cozy or Kazi and Heed? And it's so troubling. It describes a very exploitive, sexually abusive relationship. And of course, it's mirroring, the slavery and these kinds of inappropriate relationships between children and grown men. And I just wonder about like the function of taboo in her novel, and how you're using it in this book, and connecting it to class. Like, can you help us track those themes?
Yeah, and so Toni Morrison's novel entitled Love, I must tell you, I agree with you wholeheartedly that when I first read that novel many years ago, I was so troubled. Troubled. I mean, I'm like, what's going on here? And then I decided that, there's some tough topics. There are some tough topics in that novel, but I decided that I was going to go ahead and tackle this novel, right? And so of course there is a class. Class is all over a lot, if not all, of Toni Morrison's creative writing, her novels there. But there are what I call some taboo issues that we often don't like to talk about. And so I opened up the book with the Me Too movement, right? With Tarana Burke, and talking about the increase now in the media about these sexual violations. Particularly our media focuses on what women what some women have undergone. And in this book, my exploration of this particular novel, I tied these issues to racial capitalism. And what I mean by racial capitalism is not some new or different type of capitalism. I choose racial capitalism rather than the term capitalism, because I'm trying to make sure that we always pay attention to the origins of the transatlantic trade and enslaved Africans when we talk about the origins of capitalism. We often don't talk about that, right? We often leave that part out. But at any rate, I connect that to the sexual violations that Black women and men endured during the institution of slavery. Black people were both producers and reproducers. We were capital and labor. And so this is a long, ugly history, right? And the fact that you're able to reproduce and increase the wealth of the people who are owning you, this is significant. Okay, and all of the perversions, I call it perversions, that go along with that, whether sexual or not. But in this chapter, I also explore child molestation and grooming techniques, because this is all in the novel. I literally was able to pair scenes from the novel to studies in sociology and studies in women's studies and historical studies about these things. And so obviously I won't give all the details here, but I would say that some people may find that chapter triggering, but it's important to know that if you're a part of a certain class status, that you may be automatically assumed to be guilty of a sexual violation versus if you're a part of another class, right? And how if you're a part of a certain class that you may be more likely to get away with this sexual violation, which is what the Me Too movement has been highlighting, right? A lot of the people who have been brought to the forefront have been doing this for years, but they have never got in trouble, never suffered any real consequences for it. And money, if you look at criminal justice systems, if you have money, okay, you're able to literally pay your way out of the crime you've committed. So class status, class conditions, and sexual violence, they do have a close relationship, and we just can't study class alone. Class sits within a larger framework, and so my overall book sits within this analytical framework of racial capitalism.
Yeah, I know. At one point you talked about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, that there's just those connections are there, and so it's kind of confronting it is really important to do.
Right.
Yeah, so I wanted to transition a little bit. I guess I want to remind everyone you can put your questions in the Q&A. I'm happy to fold them into our conversation, but we also have lots of other stuff to talk about. So in the intro to the book, you talked a lot about your research process and spending some time in the Caribbean to learn about these communities. Can you talk about that experience, why you did it, and what some of your takeaways were from spending some time outside of the country?
Right. And so I never wanted to be that type of scholar who writes about something or talks about something and you've never been there. So even though I was raised with a lot of Caribbean influences, I'm African American with no Caribbean ancestry. And so I still wanted to, do deeper research in Caribbean nations. So I did have the opportunity to live in Jamaica for a year and conduct research, but also beyond that, I've gone to different Caribbean nations for shorter periods and I've done research there as well. And, that experience was eye-opening for me in a few different ways, but I borrowed from the fields of sociology and anthropology. As a part of their research, they do ethnography, they do field work, right? And so that's what I did. I did literary ethnography. I was out there, quote unquote, in the field. I did participant observation, where I would go to different events, participate in different activities. I volunteered in different spaces, and I also interviewed different authors, published and non-published authors, just to increase my insight about different Caribbean societies. And I must say that one of the biggest takeaways from that experience concerning my research is that I found that it is very important that you examine a society based on that particular society's ideas, rules, and beliefs about whatever topic it is that you're exploring. So it emphasized for me the importance of region-specific and nation-specific research on class conditions, because how we identify and explore and play with class in the United States is not the same way that everybody does it in every other nation. So in my book, I'm sure to analyze these literary works based on the societies in which they are set in, right? That's very important, and, the United States, we're often, dinged for doing that, always imposing our ideas and our way of life on other people. And that's not how their society works, you know? So you want to show a level of respect for these other nations and other cultures, and they know how to run their nation, right? You know, and let's respect that and use their ideas and policies and perspectives and approaches when we are engaging with them and with their work. And so that's important to do. And so the book definitely addresses a range of class perspectives. And some people identify 4 to 7 different types of classes, whether it's in the US context or Caribbean context. So back to that point about defining class being controversial and all of those blurry lines. But that experience was very enlightening, and it helped me to give a different reading of the creative writing. Like I initially thought that, well, if you're working class in one area, hey, you're working class somewhere else. But that is not the case. So just like us in the United States, you know, somebody who is working class in NYC, New York City, is not necessarily experiencing the same exact conditions as somebody who is working class in a rural area in Midwest United States somewhere, right? And so the same thing, I found that working class conditions, particularly where I was in Jamaica, those conditions were not like the working class conditions in the United States. And in many instances, I saw that the working class instances in the United States were actually better than the working class conditions for the people in Jamaica. And this really changed, especially for one of my novels that I explore in my book, Diana Macaulay's Dog Cart. You know, initially I thought the novel was about, you know, this upper class woman, mixed race woman who decided that she would help out this Black poor child. And then I was like, no, this book is about much deeper. This lady is literally highlighting human rights violations in some working class areas of this fictive Jamaican society that she has created. And what I really like about that particular novel is that Macaulay actually uses some real life places in there. So like one of the areas she uses is Mona. And so that was one of the areas that I literally was operating in when I was living there. And then she highlights a particular mall type area. She uses the name. And well, that was the mall that I often went to when I lived there. And so I could identify more with some of the descriptions, that were going on. So it was an important thing to do deeper investigation, expand my idea of literary studies. That was important to me, very important.
Yeah, and I was thinking about legacies of colonialism and transatlantic slavery and how that ties, you know, like we have a similar trunk, but these like branches expand. And so, you know, what does that bring to your understanding of the American context of working class? Is there anything specific you would point to that is similar across the two contexts?
You know, I would say, unfortunately, and this was long before I decided to tackle this book, something that I noticed just by growing up in a very international space, right, is that concerning the African diaspora, people of African descent all over the world are discriminated against. And that is something that, you know, that has always troubled me also. You know, I first became aware of this when I was a child. And so whether you were from Haiti, Jamaica, if your people were enslaved in the United States of America, like mine were, I'm noticing all of these patterns where we're discriminated against, no matter where we move through this world. And I definitely see that within the narratives that I explore as well. So yeah, my response to that, you know, and this makes me sad, but I obviously want to be genuine here, but that's one of the greatest things that stands out to me. It's a number of inequalities that we deal with.
Right. Yeah, I feel like I have a follow-up question about colorism and what that looks like in the Caribbean. So I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, that's one thing. I actually, when I interviewed some writers, I asked about colorism myself because colorism, and just to be clear, colorism is a prejudicial treatment, right? Based upon your skin tone, right? So it's not racism. And what we mean by skin tones in terms of people of African descent, like a lighter skin tone Black person is somebody like Barack Obama or Beyonce, like I said, and somebody that's darker skin tone, somebody like Akon, a singer, or Viola Davis, the actress, right? So we have a whole spectrum of shades there. And sometimes people call it shadeism, particularly in some Caribbean nations. So colorism or shadeism. And so I noticed colorism in a number of the novels. And it was something that, again, you remember I said that I didn't impose my own ideas on the novels. I allowed the novels to speak to me. And I just could not ignore the reality of colorism and how colorism, unfortunately today in many spaces, is still tied to some people's class status, where the lighter you are, the higher you are in class, and the darker you are, the more likely it is that you will be a part of a lower class. And like, for instance, I remember interviewing a couple of people specifically about Jamaica, and they were saying that you will rarely see a lighter skinned Black person in a particular working class area. And I'm like, wow, just because your skin tone, it prevents you from, it gives you privileges. Privileges come along with that. And the novels literally go there. They explore this. And I have the opportunity to ask, some writers about it. And, they expand on it and say that, some people feel like the lighter your skin is, the more opportunities you will have. And hence you have skin bleaching, right? Where you have some people using these products to literally darken their lighter, to lighten, their darker skin. And it's dangerous. Skin bleaching is dangerous, but people are literally going to any length to get a lighter skin tone so that they could be treated better. And please know that colorism certainly extends beyond people of African descent. And like in recent US media, we've been hearing more about colorism within India and other spaces like that. But also I want to touch on the history of colorism. Where does this come from? And this idea comes from people thinking that having European features is what's best, that European people, European culture, that white people, that's what's superior. So the more physical features that you have that are close to European features, then the more attractive you'll be perceived as. And so again, we can't escape that ugly history, right? Going all the way back to slavery, and where you had a separation between what was called house slaves and field slaves. And of course, we don't use the terminology slave anymore. We say enslaved African, right? But the terminology that is commonly used is the house slave and a field slave, where the people who were working in the house were lighter skinned, oftentimes, a lot of times, of course, not always. And those in the field were darker skinned. So it's just an ugly history that is still impacting us to this very day. Yeah.
Right. And it makes me think about, like mobility and moving within these classes. And even if you're skin is lighter, but you're not educated, or you're educated and you're dark skin. Like, how do you navigate these layers? And, you know, do the novels help us understand that? And, you know, I think about something like that cartoon, The Boondocks, right? Like where the grandpa brings his kids to this wealthy white neighborhood, and that transition is hard. It does not work the way you think. So even just having money or just having lighter skin doesn't guarantee entree into these higher class, you know, communities. So I don't know, what does that look like in some of the novels when you're moving around in the class?
Yeah, no, I think that's, you remember, oftentimes when we're reading creative writing, excuse me, it doesn't lead us to quote unquote the answer. Oftentimes it leads us to think more deeply about something. So that is what the novels do. They explore these topics, right? And suggest different things, of course, but what you have described is actually what the novels do. Some of the novels do is that they explore the reality of the fact that you're lighter skin and tone, but not educated, but yet you're able to get the better job than the darker skin tone person who is educated. Mm-hmm. So that is, or because of your lineage, your family background, these networks that you have and that you're associated with, and not based upon your qualification. You know, some of the novels literally explore that, and it shows this unfairness. And, you know, I think a big part of, you know, solutions, right, is that first we need to be aware of what a problem is. So first we need to be aware that, one, there is a problem. What is the problem? And then go into exploring ways to come up with solutions for it. And a lot of times these novelists, they highlight some concerning matters in which, if you didn't think about them before, or if you didn't think about the level of seriousness associated with certain things before, well, then maybe you will after coming across this reading. And so I think that that's one of the biggest things that the novels offer to us, is that they're helping us to, they're highlighting these issues and helping us to think a little bit more about them. Because believe it or not, like what you just said, right, in your posing of this questionnaire, a lot of people were not aware of that. Yeah. And then, you know, we still have stereotypes or thinking, and some people say, oh, Black people look alike, or all people from this group look alike. So then you're asking them to actually recognize the differences in skin tones. You know, that's a lot for some people. Yeah,
that note about the seriousness, that it's not just vanity happening here. Like these aren't just people wanting to be pretty. Like these are people that want to, you know, live. And that idea of you know, I want to hear you say more about it. It felt like in one of the novels, it wasn't about, you know, turning working class people into middle class people. It was about trying to have some like viable living circumstances for people in working class neighborhoods. They like their neighborhoods. They just need access to education or different kinds of housing. So, you know, I don't know if you can say more about like.
Right. You know, in my chapter on housing, you know, I dig deeply into some sociology, and I look at the work of, like, for instance, Mary Patillo, and I look at other people. And one big thing that people need to understand is that just because a person is in a working class neighborhood, please don't assume that they want to move, you know, that they want to move. No, they want to have a good living conditions right there in that neighborhood in which they live. And they should be entitled to that. You know, we should all be entitled to having access to basic services and some basic opportunities, no matter where we are in this world. And that's important to know, that why is there not access to certain things just because of your class status or the neighborhood in which you live. And no, you know, so no, everybody like, well, if we help them and give this, they'll be running to our neighborhoods. What? Everybody doesn't be in your neighborhood. people are concerned about their lived experiences and their livelihoods and their safety, right? And so I really go into detail about a lot of those types of things in that particular chapter there. That's important information to know, that people are trying to live and live well where they are. And of course, if you want to go somewhere else, yeah, that's fine. You should also have the freedom to do that as well. But I really highlighted in the book the fact that a problem is the lack of access and opportunity concerning these certain neighborhood and certain housing options.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the impact of your book and how you might use it in a classroom setting, and how do you kind of scaffold these ideas for your students? I imagine, I mean, there's so much to draw from. How do you kind of help them understand some of these topics in a semester?
Yeah, so that's teaching, right? So I'm very strategic with my teaching. Once again, going back to related issues, I'm Black. I'm a Black woman. I'm also short. I look younger than my age. So so many things come into play when I'm standing in front of a classroom, right? And this is something that I've learned many years ago. So I strategically set up my course in ways where we can intelligently engage these controversial topics without somebody, being completely flustered where they just, go wild or something, right? But actually, this semester will be the first time I teach my book, because my book just came out this month. So I am teaching my book next month is when we will explore my book. So I'm excited to see what my students have to say. And I'm teaching a really good class. They're a group of really bright students. So I'm excited to see what they say. But long before my book ever came out, some of the ideas that I've talked about thus far and that I explore in my book, we talk about these things in our class discussions. I call it, you need to provide textual evidence. So tell me what page, what line, what scene supports your claim that colorism is significant in this character's life, for instance, right? And I've long been doing that. I think that for me, teaching is a big task, right? And I don't take it lightly. I think that it gives me an opportunity to help students expand their worldviews. And that's the approach that I've always taken with my teaching. And so with the exploration of these particular novels, nothing is different concerning that, right? I still want you to expand your worldview, to think more deeply of what is your role in this global society in which we all operate.
Right, yeah. And I mean, just thinking about, literature, the humanities, libraries, sometimes people think that those are separate from issues of policy and issues of discrimination. And so, I don't know if you have ideas for libraries. I mean, the UNC Libraries is really trying to think about social justice and trying to think about ourselves as not just like passive keepers of knowledge. It's what you say, collective memory, all of that is very political. It's informed by who we are and the context that we live in. And so I don't know if there's any parallels between the ways that you are connecting humanities to real, to real social phenomenon, and what you think libraries could do as, part of that.
Yeah. So of course, as a person who started out in literary studies, I love libraries, right? I actually worked in a library when I was an undergrad. I had a part-time job in the university's library. I was one of those people who put the books back on the shelf and things like that. But I think that from what you have said, I just want to highlight public humanities. Public humanities, that it's very important to know, how is the humanities participating in our broader society? What is it that we are contributing to our broader society. And concerning libraries specifically, well, how about for my book launch, I reached out to the library at my institution, my library. They set up and organized my entire book event. So similar to what you and I are doing right now, I went to the library for this. You know, has become a part of their programming. I think that programming is important. Is the library doing events associated with diversity and inclusion? And also, I want to specify, is the library doing events associated with Black people? And the reason why I want to say Black people is because oftentimes when we have these big umbrella terms like diversity and inclusion, that means a lot of different things. And guess what? It allows you to then decrease the role of Black people, since there are so many other things that are considered diversity, right? And inclusion, right? Yeah. When we know an elephant in the room, particularly for the United States of America, is the harsh treatment, the continued history of the harsh treatment of Black people. So is there any programming around that? And actually, I was just on a call with my library last week, because they're organizing, they acquired an archive of a notable Black person, August Wilson. I'll say that.
Wow. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And you know, he was raised in Pittsburgh, and I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. And they're creating an entire huge week-long event and celebration in a year around this archive in the library. And they've reached out to not only different departments at our university, but at other universities across the nation and other different types of institutions, like community centers, even some of the like public schools and museums like that. So there are so many things that libraries can do if they really are interested in highlighting these issues and being a part of making things better. And like I said earlier, is that one big thing to do is to recognize that there is a problem, to highlight that there is a problem. So if that's what you do, and that's the only thing that you do, that in itself is a part of the journey, and that's significant. So nobody is asking the librarians to sit down and come up with how to resolve racism. No, okay, you can't do that, okay? But we are asking, like, are there programming ideas that you have that can be of a service of the students at your institution, the students in the surrounding area in which your university is housed in, or your library is housed, things like that. Now, no matter what, I tell my students, back to teaching, I teach students from majors across, from STEM fields, social science, humanities. I teach a wide array of students every single semester. And I always tell them, no matter what your area is, you can be a part of making things better for somebody. And of course, libraries definitely can do that.
Yes, that's incredible. Thank you. That feels like the pep talk, right, that we need to get into the semester. I wanted to give one last call for anybody in the audience. I wanted to write in a question and maybe give Dr. Brooks a chance if there's anything that we didn't touch on that you want to share before we close out in a few minutes. But is there any kind of last points you might make about the book or your work?
Yeah, I want to say that I'm really grateful for this collaboration that UNC Libraries, that your system has with UNC Press. I think that is great. And this event in itself, it is a part of making things better. You're highlighting these issues, very real issues. So kudos to you all for having such a collaboration. And I do want to say, I want to give a big shout out to UNC Press. Like, oh my God, I had such a wonderful experience with this press. I mean, literally from day one, when I sent the email to the editor inquiring about whether or not, would you like to see my book proposal? I mean, I ended up speaking with him that day. Like, okay, where does that happen?
Right,
But it
right.
was a coincidence that he would be in the office that day. And I mean, literally from day one, things took off. And then now, I'm in the publicity stage, right? And
Yeah.
they're helpful with that because, I feel like I'm a juggler, right? Right now, I'm like, okay, you got this event, you got this, you need to send this tweet, send this email. I'm like, oh my God, so what is going on here? There's a whole nother world in the post-book publication stage. And so UNC Press, I mean, kudos, just an excellent, I have had such an excellent experience. I did not have any, bumps along the way. And this is something that a lot of writers fear, right? Because you have to get reviews of your book. And if one of the reviews is not good, then bye-bye, you won't be publishing. Sometimes, you won't be publishing with that press, right? You'll be rejected. And, I just had such an awesome experience and a helpful experience. And I really want to publicly say that I'm really grateful for that. So kudos to them and kudos to you all too. I'm really grateful and I thank you all for this opportunity to sit and talk about the book. So I hope that somebody learned something.
Yes, and that's a credit to you and the strength of your content and the way you organize information, and you're hitting on something that we all need to know about. And so I'm glad for the resource, and I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brooks, for your time.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Robin and Chaitra, thank you so much for such a lively and insightful conversation. I want to also thank my libraries and press colleagues, similar to what Robin was just saying, especially members of the Idea Council, Katie Fanfani and Sonia Bonchek, for making everything they did to make this event possible. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today to hear about Dr. Brooks's book. Don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use your 40% discount to buy this book. Check out the promo code in the chat. The Off the Shelf series continues next month with a conversation with Dr. Anne Gray Fisher and her book, The Streets Belong to Us, Sex, Race, and Police Power from Segregation to Gentrification on Thursday, March 24th from noon to 1 p.m.